Hi friends, welcome to Chapter 3, Communication in the Self. So in Chapter 1 I discussed the various fields of communication and the different trends in research. Chapter 3 looks really at that intrapersonal communication, how our internal dialogue shapes our perceptions of who we are and how we in turn communicate those perceptions to the people around us. So in Chapter 1, we're going to be looking at the self-concept. So this lecture, we'll go ahead and define self-concept. I'll go ahead and explain how it develops and how we can change our self-concept. Next, we will look at the presenting self. So how we communicate those perceptions to the people around us. And so we'll look at communication identity management theory in Goffman's dramaturgical perspective. Lastly, we'll touch on self-disclosure. Again, the communication of disclosing personal information to those around us. So we'll look at models of self-disclosure, the benefits and risks of self-disclosure, and of course, alternatives to self-disclosure. So let's go ahead and get started. What is the self-concept? Essentially, the self-concept are the relatively stable set of perceptions we hold of ourselves. Self-esteem are the evaluations of self-worth based on those perceptions. So I perceive myself to be of short stature. So I'm 5'6", right now 5'5" because I'm not wearing any shoes. So I perceive myself to be short. Now, my evaluation of that physical quality I have, whether it's positive or negative, will influence my self-esteem. So this is derived from this cognitive triangle. And the cognitive triangle hypothesizes that our thoughts directly influence how we feel, and how we feel influences our behavior. And that behavior we engage in reinforces our thoughts. This whole process is quite interesting in how it influences the development of our self-concept. And so if we're constantly thinking negative thoughts about ourselves, then that's going to influence how we feel about ourselves. And consequently, our behavior is going to reflect those feelings, reinforcing those initial thoughts. Now, the great news is we can change our thoughts, our feelings, and our behavior. It takes a lot of hard work, but it is doable. So I invite you at this time to watch this video on this concept called neuroplasticity. So neuroplasticity is the flexibility of our cognition to be able to learn new ways of thinking, new ways of behaving, new ways of feeling. And it really stems from consciousness, really being attentive to our thought patterns and how we feel and respond to those thoughts. The next section I would like to cover is how the self-concept develops. So I briefly touched on the cognitive triangle. In the textbook, there are two predominant theories that take into consideration the development of the self-concept. The first one is through reflected appraisals. So our self-concept are created partly by the judgments and the appraisals we receive from other individuals. So a parent might continually communicate to their child that they're a great artist, or they're very creative, or they're very diligent. Consequently, that child is being reinforced with this understanding of who they are. So we typically only pay attention to reflected appraisals through significant others. So these are close individuals within our lives, such as family, friends, relational partners. We typically give their feedback or their appraisals more weight. So if a stranger comes up and criticizes you, chances are, yeah, it might hurt for a little bit. You might brush it off, right? But if a friend comes up to you and points out a concern, you're more likely to pay attention to that information. The next method or process in which the self-concept develops is through this social comparison. So social comparison theory, developed by Fitzinger in 1954, proposes that we evaluate ourselves in terms of how we compare to others in our immediate surroundings. So the people in our immediate surroundings, or those people that we compare ourselves with, are titled reference groups. Now, Fitzinger argues that we could do upward comparisons or downward comparisons. When we compare ourselves to the people around us, I think this is a very natural thing to do. This is a way of figuring out if we fit in within a specific context, if we need to change our behavior or conform to the group. So we can participate in upward or downward comparison. Downward comparisons is the process in which we compare ourselves to those below us in some sort of way. And so we could look at skill set, we could look at socioeconomic status, we could look at, level of attraction, all of those things to engage in that comparison. And so Fitzinger found that people who engaged in a downward comparison had an increase in positive regard. So if you're having a bad day and things aren't going your way, you might compare your current situation to someone who is experiencing something more severe. And then participating in that comparison, we realize, well, maybe, my situation isn't that bad, right? So downward comparisons can increase our perceptions of self-regard. Upward comparisons is when we engage in upward comparisons with a reference group that is superior than us in some sort of way. So this could be, again, income, it could be socioeconomic status, it could be all sorts of different things. Fitzinger argues that when we constantly engage in this upward comparison, that could actually lower our self-regard. However, research later on social comparison theory found that when individuals engage in upward comparisons, there could be instances where this could be beneficial, right? So maybe you feel inspired to work towards a particular career, or maybe you follow a fitness model because you're inspired to maintain your health or to change your habits, right? So upward comparisons can be beneficial. However, when we are constantly comparing ourselves, this can be dangerous in terms of our self-esteem and our self-concept. So at the very top of this slide, I have a quote from Theodore Roosevelt, which states, "Comparison is the thief of joy." And so if we're constantly comparing ourselves with others, we're constantly in that high self-monitoring state where we're trying to figure out how to fit in. Consequently, I think we lose a sense of our authentic identity if we're constantly trying to adapt to our situations. So let's go ahead and move on to characteristics of the self-concept. So the self-concept is really subjective, and it's based on our own personal biases. It can be based on obsolete information. So we change over time. However, our perceptions sometimes stay the same. And so while we might perceive ourselves to lack a certain skill, we develop that skill over time, and our perceptions lag. Take, for example, when I started college, I had very low self-esteem. I didn't feel that I was smart enough to be in college. And here I am working on my PhD. So obviously my skill set has grown over my academic journey. However, sometimes that perception, like I'm not smart enough, I'm not good enough, I don't have what it takes, sometimes those still creep up in everyday life. And so I constantly have to remind myself, Colin, you've developed the skills to be successful in this environment. Don't allow that outdated perception influence the present. Now, the self-concept could be distorted. Sometimes we receive false feedback or praise by others. So maybe at the office, or maybe from a friend, or someone in our social network. They might give us false feedback, and we take that feedback and attach it to our self-concept. So I think about parents cheering on their child in a sporting event. Obviously the child might not have the skill set to perform that sport at a high level. But of course, the parents aren't going to say that. They're going to cheer. They're going to, reinforce that behavior. Sometimes we ignore negative qualities. And so, again, the self-concept could be distorted because we don't want to face the truth. We don't want to face maybe our limitations. So we tend to view ourselves more favorably. This is called self-bias. On the contrary, though, some individuals view themselves more harshly than what is warranted. So I teach public speaking as well, COM 1, and oftentimes my students really struggle with this. They judge their own performances and their speeches more harshly. And I always have to remind them, look, you're developing these skills. It's not going to be perfect, but you did actually really well in that speech. So again, finding that right balance between judging ourselves appropriately is something that we should strive to work on. So on the right is just a model of the congruences and incongruences between our perceptions of who we are and who we actually are in real life. And so when we have incongruencies between our perceptions and who we are, that is illustrated in the graph on the left-hand side of that graph. On the far right, we see the congruence between our perceptions of who we are and who we are in real life. So when we look at the self, it's easy just to look at our own self as the singular dimension. But if you really think about it, there are three distinct selves that we possess. So what are they? Well, there's the actual self. These are attributes that an individual possesses. However, we have this ideal image of who we like to be. And these are attributes we would ideally like to have. Lastly is the ought self. These are the attributes an individual should possess based on what's prescribed to them in their social context. And so the actual self is like who we are in real life. The ideal self is kind of this image we have of ourselves in the best case scenario. And then the ought self is the self that is projected onto us based on our surroundings. So take, for example, like this is me. I'm standing in my room in shorts. You can't see that, right? This is in flip-flops. This is the actual self, right? It's me in the moment. The ideal self, I have this idea of who I would like to be as an instructor presenting this content to you. Now, the ought self is kind of the pressures put on me based on the overall expectations of what it means to be an instructor, professor, and so forth. And so I'm trying to adapt all those various selves in order to communicate effectively. So when we are engaged in a dyadic interaction, this is communication between two people, we're actually dealing with 6 people. So you're like, wait, if I'm having a personal one-on-one conversation with a friend or someone I'm dating or maybe a partner or my child, there's actually 6 people in that interaction, right? So not only are you communicating from the perspective of your actual self, but you're also communicating from the ideal self, how you ideally would like to present yourself in front of this person. And then the ought self, some of the prescriptions placed on you based on that interaction. Similarly, the other person is communicating from those same perspectives. Let's go ahead and dive a little bit further in how we communicate the self-concept and how the self-concept develops. So if you've taken any psychology class, chances are you've looked at self-fulfilling prophecies. So self-fulfilling prophecies occurs when a person's expectations of an event affects his or her behavior, and therefore making the predicted outcome more likely to occur than would have otherwise been true. So this is similar to the cognitive triangle in terms of our beliefs influence our expectations about a particular interaction or event or phenomena. Our expectations will influence our behavior, and our behavior obviously influences the results we get, and those results will reinforce those beliefs. So self-fulfilling prophecies can be negative or positive based on our beliefs. They could be self-imposed, so we could impose these beliefs, these self-fulfilling prophecies on ourselves, or they could be imposed by others. So to illustrate this point a little bit further, I have two examples. The first one is, again, referring to my public speaking students. Most people hate public speaking. It's uncomfortable. People feel vulnerable. Most individuals don't like it. And so there's a belief in my students coming into the semester of, into that class of public speaking that I do not like public speaking. I'm not good at it. I'm not sure why I have to do this. And so their beliefs tend to be negative. Consequently, what do you think the expectations are for that class? It's going to be horrible. It's going to be painful. They're going to feel vulnerable, all of that. And so when we feel threatened by a particular event or a context, when we feel vulnerable, our behavior really reflects this process of trying to protect ourselves. And so one way to protect ourselves from feeling vulnerable or, experiencing something unpleasant is maybe to avoid that whole situation. And so oftentimes, people avoid certain situations because they expect it to be unpleasant. And as a result, they don't grow in their skill set, and that reinforces their beliefs. And so usually when I teach public speaking, this is the very first thing we focus on: how to change our beliefs about public speaking, how to set realistic but positive expectations for that environment, and to work really hard on achieving the results that we want. The next example that I have is from some unethical research performed by Dr. Weldon Johnson in 1930. And this is an example of how self-fulfilling prophecies can form when other people impose them on us. So Dr. Weldon Johnson was a speech pathologist, and he was interested in researching stuttering problems or stuttering speech patterns. And he wanted to know if individuals could develop a stuttering problem. And so the reason why this research is unethical is because he used orphans at that time as an experimental group. And so he took a group of orphans and repeatedly told them that they had a stuttering problem, and when they didn't have one. And at the end of the experiment, most of these children developed a stuttering condition, even though they didn't have that prior to the study. This is really unethical research, and from this research and a ton of other unethical research studies, higher education and research institutes developed a review board. So anytime that research is being conducted with live human participants, it has to go through an ethics review board. So a few weeks ago, I wrapped up a research study that looked at attachment theory and if we could use various attachment styles to predict social media addiction. And because I was surveying human participants, I had to go through this whole process of getting my study approved by an ethics review board. So the great thing is that we very rarely see unethical research being performed today. But this is an example of how others can impose a self-fulfilling prophecy on us. So maybe we grew up in an environment where we were not affirmed as a child, or maybe we received false or negative feedback from our caregivers. Potentially this shapes the way we perceive ourselves as adults in our lives. So I invite you to reflect on your past experiences and see how self-fulfilling prophecies are applicable to your life. So now that we have covered the self-concept, how it develops, and some of the characteristics of the self-concept, now we are going to look at how we present the self to other people. So the presenting self, communication as identity management. So identity management is the communication strategies we use to influence how people view us. So this model on the right breaks up the identity management into two parts. The first part is the perceived self, and this is illustrated at the core, or the private self. The private self is the self we know ourselves to be in moments of truth and honest reflection. So it's the aspects that reflect who we truly are. This could include feelings, hardships, insecurities, all that stuff. The presenting self is the public image we communicate to everyone else. And so, guarantee we all have insecurities. So as you watch this, I want you to think about what's your biggest insecurity in life, right? Now that is something that you truly know about yourself. Now, I don't want you to, dwell on, that insecurity, but I want you to think, who knows that information about you? Maybe it's your close best friend, maybe it's a family member, maybe it's your partner, but beyond that very close circle of individuals, chances are you don't go into the workplace, saying, hey, everyone, this is my biggest insecurity, right? So this is the presenting self. It's the image we would like to share with other people. Similarly, we could think of this in terms of Goffman's dramaturgical perspective. So Goffman argues that humans are active and knowledgeable. We devise our own conduct, essentially our own play and scripts of how we live our lives. We guide and control how others see us. So as humans, we're different in social settings than when we are alone. Essentially, Goffman had this idea that humans are social con artists. And so if you look on the right, this is a picture of the theater, I think in Vienna. And this illustrates Goffman's perspective, this dramaturgical perspective. One way we could think about it is in this theater. We have the front stage and the backstage. So this picture is looking at the front stage from the viewpoint of the backstage. So think about the backstage as the private self. This is your thought process, who you are, everything that is behind the scenes. And so if you look at this picture, you see, again, all of the lights, the curtains, all the pulleys and the ropes and the huge stage. But if you're sitting in the audience, you don't see all of that. You just see all the grandeur and the glory of the theater. So similarly, when we go about our everyday lives, we are presenting a self-image that is favorable to the public audience. However, we know deep down inside that maybe that self-image that we're presenting doesn't accurately reflect who we are. So this process of presenting an image that is appropriate for a given context, we call this face. Face is the socially approved identity we present in a given situation. So in this context, you might present the face of a diligent student. I might be presenting a face of a competent instructor or, someone who's intelligent, right? Face threats are perceived threats to the presenting image or our social identity. And so sometimes when people call us out or challenge us, we perceive that as a face threat. Now, we could lose face as a result of this, or we engage in face work. Now, face work are the verbal and nonverbal behaviors which we use to maintain our own presenting image. So the graph here looks at this face threat and loss sequence. And so oftentimes we can engage in various communication tactics to maintain our face or to restore our face when we feel it's threatened or when we have lost our face, when we have lost our face. So preventative face work would include disclaimers, tact, showing interest through discourse markers. So oftentimes, if you're at a meeting and you aren't fully prepared, you don't want to appear as a slacker or someone who hasn't done their homework. And so you might put a disclaimer before participating in that meeting by saying, oh, I had, there was traffic, or I spilled coffee on me, or there's a lot going on at home. So just keep that in mind if I am not prepared for this meeting. So that's preventative face work. When we actually lose face, we go in this corrective face work. And this might be an apology. It could be an excuse, a justification, remediation. It could be humor. It could be avoidance, or it could be aggression. And we use that to restore our face, to maintain that socially appropriate identity in a given context. So this whole concept of face threats, face loss, and face work is very interesting. And you could see this happening in everyday interactions in your life. Okay, so characteristics of identity management. Essentially, we're balancing multiple identities all at the same time. So from chapter 2, we looked at, how this could be age, race, ethnicity, sexual orientation, maybe a disabilities. It could be our values or belief systems, right? We're trying to balance all of these different identities within a given context or setting. So identity management tends to be collaborative. So that means I'm trying to manage my identity as a professor, and I'm in a collaborative communication process with you because you're trying to maintain your identity maybe as a student, right? Even though, the instructor is not the only identity that I ascribe to, and you, being that student, your student identity is just one very small facet of who you are as an individual. So we try to collaborate to manage our identities while interacting with one another. So we could be very deliberate or unconscious on how we manage our identity. So I would like for you to reflect what situations might require deliberate identity management. Again, a few things come to mind. In the workplace, sometimes we have to maintain a particular identity, or maybe in a job interview, or maybe in a class environment. These, very professional, formal situations is when we typically are more deliberate in managing our identity. When we are in our social settings, when we're relaxed, when we're around, close individuals, we tend to decrease the level of identity management we engage in, is because it's more relaxed environments, more informal. So we see that there are different degrees of identity management. So we see that high self-monitors versus low self-monitors. We see that, high context versus low context cultures. There's various differences in how we engage in identity management. So the next section, the last section that we're going to cover in chapter 3 is self-disclosure. So what is self-disclosure? Essentially, it's information about the self that is purposefully communicated to another person. Self-disclosure is personal information. It's purposefully communicated. The book says that it's verbally communicated. However, I don't like that because that's assuming that self-disclosure is only communicated through spoken language. And we see that individuals in the deaf community still purposefully communicate with the absence of verbal language, right? It's a signed language. So I would say that, it's personal information communicated purposefully. The receiver, the listener, is the target of that information. We see that self-disclosure is extremely important for building intimacy and trust within developing relationships. So over on the right are just some research examples of the importance of self-disclosure. So the first one is that perceived responsiveness to partner self-disclosure significantly correlated with intimacy. So just the fact of perceived responsiveness, showing responsiveness to when a partner is sharing really personal information, correlates with increased intimacy. And so this is research that, again, supports that, when we really pay attention to the self-disclosure of the people around us, that's how we build intimacy. And the way that I'm talking about intimacy is not necessarily physical intimacy, but intimacy is the ability to know someone on a deeper level and predict their behavior. So that emotional closeness. Self-disclosure, the second example, self-disclosure is associated with attraction and relational satisfaction in both developing and already developed relationships. So, self-disclosure is not just something you do when you're in a dating relationship trying to get to know the person, or, in a new friendship and you're trying to build that friendship, but self-disclosure is really important for sustaining and maintaining those deep relationships throughout life. So let's take a look at some of the characteristics of self-disclosure. We talked about the self is the subject, it's intentional, it's directed at another person. Self-disclosure is honest. Right? We can't lie about who we are. Like we could totally lie or misrepresent ourselves, but that wouldn't constitute authentic self-disclosure. That would be more like manipulation or deception. And so really self-disclosure is that honest revealing of maybe our thoughts, our insecurities, our feelings, all of that stuff. It's revealing. It contains information unavailable from other sources. It's intimate based on the context in which it's shared. So appropriateness. So what do I mean by this? Self-disclosure, again, is really important for developing those close relationships. However, if really personal self-disclosure takes place in a context in which that's not appropriate, that could actually have adverse effects. So think about inappropriate self-disclosure in the workplace. Or I had a friend who would always share his feelings in a developing relationship too early on. So like after the first date, he's the type of person that would be like, I really like you. I think we should, be in a committed relationship. And oftentimes that would freak out his, dating partner or the person he was seeing. And so, we have to be a little bit careful with self-disclosure. We have to think about the time and the place and the context in which that self-disclosure transpires. Is because, again, just because you reveal personal information doesn't mean that that happens in an appropriate context. So these are just different types of self-disclosure categories. There's like cliches. These are social norms for interactions, like, oh, what are your likes, dislikes? What's your favorite color? What type of music do you like? Do you like vanilla ice cream or chocolate ice cream? They're just cliches. Like, that information is not going to really booster that relationship any. Right? Then there's facts about the self. So these could be past experiences. These could be facts about who you are. And then opinions. This is how you feel about different things. And so, again, we have different opinions, different perspectives on what's going on around us. And so sharing those opinions and beliefs and those values could be another form of self-disclosure. So how does this happen? So I mentioned that the context matters. And so we are going to look at Altman and Taylor's social penetration theory. And this gives a broader conceptualization of how self-disclosure happens in conversations. And so first we'll look at the theoretical assumptions of social penetration theory. Their first theoretical assumption really points to the progression of relationships. So relationships progress from non-intimate to intimate. It's a very linear approach to understanding the development of relationships. Relational development is generally systematic and predictable. So no matter what type of relationship you're developing, it's systematic and predictable. We can predict different phases in a developing relationship. So we'll talk more about that in chapter 9 when we get there. Relational development includes deep penetration and disillusion. So up to this point, a lot of research only focused on how relationships develop, but largely ignored how relationships come apart or dissolve. And even in this model, the stage in which they look at the deep penetration or dissolution is very sparse. We have more updated theories and models that take a look at the dissolution or how relationships come apart. Again, we'll look at that in chapter 9. So self-disclosure is at the core of relationship development. So there are different stages in which we engage in self-disclosure in a developing relationship. This first stage is called the orientation stage. This is where we see people engage in small talk to orientate themselves with this other person. Exploratory affective stage is when we start to reveal the inner self and express more personal attitudes about society. After that stage, we go into this, what Altman and Taylor calls the affective stage. This is where we share and talk about private personal matters. Maybe, some of the challenges we faced growing up, our family dynamics, our, political opinions or beliefs, right? After that, we emerge into this stable stage. This is when the relationship reaches a deep, intimate level and emotional reactions are predictable. And then, of course, that last stage is the depenetration stage. This is the dissolution, the breakdown, or decrease in self-disclosure. So this model is called the onion model. And the reason why it's called the onion model is because it has rings. And so, if you're familiar with Shrek, I think it was a Disney film, could be Pixar, I don't know. But Shrek, at one point in the film, talks to Donkey and says, ogres are like onions, right? They have layers. And so people are like onions. We have different layers, right? So in this model, we see that the circumference of the model signifies breadth. And this is the different aspects about life that we self-disclose about. The depth is essentially the intensity of that self-disclosure, or how revealing that self-disclosure is. So this is the model that is illustrated in the textbook. And so if you look at all these different elements of life that you could communicate, you could talk about your career ambitions, feelings about your relationships, maybe relationships you have with the opposite sex, maybe your family and background problems. It could be maybe academic life, your opinions about mutual friends, or your feelings about your physical appearances, right? So these are all examples of various different things you can self-disclose about. Now, the intensity or the depth of that self-disclosure might fluctuate based on the topic. And so in this graph, you see that this individual is very open about sharing their career ambitions. But when it comes to communicating or self-disclosing information regarding family background and problems, that self-disclosure is very shallow. So this is the social penetration theory. Similarly, we have another model to think about or conceptualize self-disclosure, and this is entitled the Johari Window. John and Harry were like researchers. I think his name was John. It might have been Joseph, but essentially there are two researchers and they combined their names. And that's why we get the Johari Window. When I first learned about this, I didn't know that. I was like, why is it called the Johari Window? It's just a mashup of the researchers who developed this framework. But essentially in the Johari Window, we could look at self-disclosure in terms of these four conditions. So in the first column on the left, if we look at this column, it's entitled known to self. So this is information you know about yourself, right? So this, on the right-hand side, the column on the right-hand side, this is information you don't know about yourself. Now, if we look at the rows, we see the first row is information known to others. And the bottom row is information not known to others. And so when we take these rows and these columns and we look at the intersect of each of these categories, we get different conditions of self-disclosure. And so let's take a look at the very top left-hand corner. This is the open area. This is information you know about yourself and other people know about you as well. It's that information's out in the open, right? Similarly, like if we took this environment, like I know you're an RCC student, that information's open. I know your name because you've shared that. You know my name, right? It's open area, right? However, if we go directly below that square, this is information we know about ourselves, but other people don't know this information about us, and we call that the hidden area. So obviously there's information about myself that I'm not going to share with you, and vice versa. There's private information that you're going to maintain that privacy and not disclose it to individuals around you. So that's the hidden area. Let's go ahead and go up to the top right-hand corner. And this is what we call our blind spot. Now, this is information we don't know about ourselves, but other people see it in us or know this about us. So I mentioned that friend who, after the first date would express his undying love for the person that he was dating. This is something that, everyone in our friend group recognized in our friend. But our friend who was doing that could not see it in himself. And so that was the information he didn't know about himself, but everyone else kind of knew that about him. And so this was his blind spot. So we all have blind spots. We, don't know this information about ourselves. We aren't in tune to it, but maybe other people see it. And of course, the bottom right-hand window is the unknown. This is where we don't know this about ourselves and other people don't know it about ourselves. It's the great unknown. So the book doesn't show this graph, but I feel like it's very helpful. So on the right, you get, again, this Johari window, but two communication methods we can use to expand our open area. And so if we want to decrease our blind spot, we should seek out feedback from the people around us. Oftentimes I do this with my papers that I write. I ask colleagues to review them, is because when I'm writing a paper, it makes sense up here, but maybe, as the reader, it's not being communicated effectively. And so asking feedback allows us to decrease that blind spot. To expand the open area and to decrease the hidden area, we engage in self-disclosure. This is what we've been talking about for the last couple of minutes. And so by disclosing that private information, again, we decrease that hidden area. And so when we engage in feedback and disclosure, that expands this open area and consequently decreases our unknown condition. So really fascinating concept. The Johari window is something that you should study, as there's a few questions on the midterm regarding this. Okay, so let's talk about the benefits and risks of self-disclosure. The benefits includes catharsis, and this is venting or vocalizing our burdens. So sometimes you've probably experienced this phenomena where a stranger on the plane or, some random stranger walks up to you and starts communicating, sharing all their personal information and their life struggles. And you're probably thinking to yourself, why are you sharing this information? It's because sharing that information is healing. It's almost like free therapy. Self-clarification. So sometimes we disclose private information in order to clarify misinterpretations that other people have of us. Sometimes we use self-disclosure as self-validation. I think the key benefit is reciprocity. And so if you share private information with someone else, they're more likely to share similar information with you. So just think about how conversations naturally emerge. You might introduce yourself and say, "Hi, my name is so-and-so." That other person feels compelled to share similar or equal information. So they might be like, "Oh, hey, so-and-so, my name's so-and-so. I like chocolate ice cream. Oh, wow, I like, vanilla ice cream." It's kind of like this, again, reciprocity. It's a give and take interaction. Sometimes we self-disclosure as a form of impression management, again, shaping our impressions of others. Relationship maintenance. Sometimes we have to disclose out of moral obligation. Social influence and self-defense, right? So these are all the benefits of self-disclosure. Now, there are risks associated with revealing private personal information to others. So one theory that takes into consideration the risks of self-disclosure is expectancy violation theory. And so expectancy violation theory by Burgoon argues that when our expectations for a given event or circumstance are violated, we have either a positive or a negative reaction to that violation. And so if you expected public speaking to be extremely hard, painful, difficult, right? And those expectations were violated because the class environment was actually very supportive. It was fun. It was, uplifting, and you developed all these great skills. Then your expectations are still violated, but there was a positive outcome, right? So sometimes, self-disclosure can violate people's expectations, like they weren't expecting that information, but in the right context, that could help build a deeper relationship. Now, again, we talked about, context matters. And if you're in, the office or at work and, you communicate or self-disclose private information, that could, again, violate people's expectations. They weren't expecting that information, and it could have negative consequences. Rejection is a risk of self-disclosure. Non-reciprocity. So sometimes we share private information and that same level of information isn't given back to us. Negative impression. Sometimes if we disclose too much at one setting, people may develop a negative impression of us. We see that self-disclosure can lead to relational dissatisfaction, especially when, we're self-disclosing maybe feelings with a partner. Loss of influence, loss of control, and potentially our self-disclosure could hurt others. So the loss of control is this is developed through communication privacy management. And so when we share private information to another person, that other person becomes co-ownership of that information. Essentially, they can spread it elsewhere. And so this is like how rumors or gossip starts, right? And so when we do share private information, we lose a sense of control over the privacy of that information. So the last little bit of this chapter, the book talks about alternatives to self-disclosure. There's silence, which is withholding information. The book talks about lying, and there's different types of lying. So there's a deliberate attempt to hide or misrepresent the truth. This is super unethical, for many different cultures and belief systems. However, there's malevolent lies. And these are non-malicious lies. And so these are less truthful. So this is when we communicate in a less truthful manner in order to avoid hurting someone's feelings, right? Essentially, it's saving face. So you might tell a friend who walked through the library with a piece of toilet paper stuck on their shoe. You might, lie to them and say, oh, don't feel embarrassed. No one saw it. When in fact, everybody did. Or you could save face for yourself. And, this excuse, I think people use this when they break up with someone. They always say, oh, no, it's not you, it's me. I'm just not ready for commitment. But maybe the reality of the situation is, yeah, maybe it is the other person. Presenting a competent image. Sometimes we engage in this malevolent lie in order to maintain the presenting self. So maybe if we weren't paying attention in class or in a business meeting and our supervisor asks us, hey, were you taking notes? We don't want to be like, no, I was checked out. I was daydreaming. We're going to probably engage in that face-saving tactic of saying, oh yeah, I was listening. Or maybe leave taking, so think about it when you're stuck in a conversation and, you don't want to just abruptly end the conversation and say, look, I'm tired of this conversation. You might look at your watch and say, oh, I have an appointment to go to, when in fact you didn't, right? So there's different levels of intensity or different categories of lying. So at the end of the semester, I do offer an extra credit opportunity where I invite you to read this research article entitled Routine Expression of Deceptive Affection. And so we see that deceptive affection can have pro-social benefits within relationships, even though it's a deceptive act. So I invite you to read that towards the end of the semester for the extra credit and answer questions on it. Equivocation. This is another alternative to self-disclosure. And this is communicating in a vague way that leaves the interpretation up to the individual or to the listener. So equivocation is when, again, what we say has two or more equally plausible meanings. So it's like the middle ground between the unpleasant truth and just flat out lying. Okay, so chapter 3, we covered a lot of information. We talked about the self-concept, those relatively stable set of perceptions we have of ourselves, and how that self-concept develops, through reflected appraisals and social comparison theory. We also talked about how we can disrupt self-fulfilling prophecies, start changing that inner dialogue that we engage in order to reflect a more positive image of ourselves. The presenting self, we looked at how we communicate the self to other people through communication identity management, and we looked at Goffman's dramaturgical perspective, having the front stage and the backstage, or the perceived self and public self. And lastly, we looked at self-disclosure, the different models of self-disclosure, benefits of risks of self-disclosure, and various alternatives to self-disclosure. So thank you so much for listening and participating in Chapter 3 lecture. We'll see you next time.